We're going to begin this tutorial by talking about completing the square and the key to completing the square. Now, we've talked about this in class for a number of days. Completing the square, ultimately what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking an equation and we're going to learn to, number one, put it into vertex form, and then we're going to learn how to solve a quadratic that by completing the square. We use completing the square when I can't factor. Now, the particular problem I have can be factored a little bit, but I wanted to use this particular problem. So we'll assume for to begin with that we can't factor the problem. If you can factor and if you've been given the choice, then you always want to try to factor the problem. That's going to be a much easier process. But sometimes you can't factor the problem, or maybe you wanted to put it into vertex form. And this is exactly how we're going to do that. The key is b over 2 squared. This is by far the one thing that you have to remember. If you can't remember this, then you're not really going to be able to complete the square. So the problem that we're going to start with is 3x squared plus 6x plus 15 equals 0. I've broken it down into several steps. I broke it down into more steps than probably I needed to, but I wanted to make this I wanted to make it a very easy process. So not that you have to remember all 6 steps, but it's a matter of getting this idea into your head and practicing it. Okay, I don't think you need to, I've got to do 6 things. No, I think you just need to learn it. I took it and I made it into more steps. It needs to be more steps than we did in class as well. But just go through it, learn the process. First step is to get the terms with x on one side. Okay, so we have the 3x squared and the 6x, and then we have the negative 15 on this side. So what I did was I just subtracted 15 from both sides. And I've left this little space here on purpose. That'll come in later. Second step, we're going to go in, we're going to look at our number here. I need x squared's coefficient to be a 1. Well, right now it's a 3. So I'm going to have to factor a 3 out of both of these values. Okay, when I factor that out, I get the 3 outside. That leaves me with x squared plus 2x. If I multiply back, 3 times x squared gives me 3x squared. 3 times 2x is 6x. Exactly as I started with. You always double check that just to make sure you did it right. All right. The next step is we're going to fill in this blank using our key. Remember the key. Look back up here. The key was b over 2 squared. Well, I look now that I factored it. I look and I find out exactly what b is. B in this particular problem is going to be 2. So I go ahead, I go over here, I'm going to place that into my little mini formula here, my key. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. So I'm going to put that 1, positive 1, into the blank. Next step. Now this is tricky. This is the part that if you're going to make a careless mistake, this is where it is. Most of the time, if I don't have this number outside, if I don't have a 3 here, and it was originally an x squared by itself, I would just add 1 to both sides. But I don't. So in order to get it over on the side, I've got to get it outside of my parentheses first. Step 4 takes us and we do that process. The only thing I have to remember to do is multiply the number that's inside that we added from here. I have to multiply that times the number outside. So I do 3 times 1 equals 3. Now make sure to add this to the other side. And it is very possible to end up with a negative number here. And in that case, I would just subtract it. So I add that to my negative 15, and I get 3 times x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals negative 12. All right? The next step could be difficult if you don't learn what you're looking for. Otherwise, it's extremely easy. I have to replace what's inside the parentheses with a something squared, right? It's going to be x, and it's going to be whatever I put into my key. Whatever it was before I squared it. Now, this happens to be 1, and 1 squared is the same as 1. Okay, but a lot of times, if you remember from class, whatever we put here was different. The only time it's the same is when you have a 1. Whatever it is right before we square it that's what I'm going to put right here. If that's a positive 1, I put positive 1. If that was negative 1 squared, I would put negative 1. Whatever sign is up here, it just exactly replicates right here. Okay? I don't do anything to the side. And now I went from x squared plus 2x plus 1. Now, if you're good at factoring, you can say, well, I could have factored that in my head. And I said, oh, that's just x plus 1 times x plus 1. Well, that's what this means, x plus 1 squared. If it gets more difficult, I don't really have to think. I can go back up and look there and just transfer that number down to this part. Now, at this step, at this stage, I can go to 2 places. If the question says find the vertex form, then I would go, let's go over to the right just a little bit. I would go right here. I would go ahead and add the 12 to both sides and set it equal to y. And you can see that right there. 3 times x plus 1 squared plus 12 would be the vertex form, where I have negative 1, 12 as my vertex. Sometimes it says solve for x. And I'm going to take this, and that's probably more common what we're going to do with these problems, is I'm going to go and I'm going to go ahead and solve for x. And this is actually just basic algebra. I'm going to divide by 3 first. So here we have our equation. I got to get rid of the 3, which is divide by 3 on both sides. That gives us x plus 1 squared equals negative 4. Now, remember, we're following the order of operations. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, or PEMDAS, however you remember it. Before I can get rid of the square, I have to get rid of everything else outside of my parentheses. Well, the only thing outside the parentheses is a 3. And to get rid of the 3, we have to divide by 3 on both sides. And that's how we come to this step. The next step is, well, I've only got a squared part equal to a number. And so what I'm going to do now is square root both sides. So I take the square root of this, which just cancels out with the square, leaves me with this what's inside the parentheses, and I take the square root of negative 4, that's plus or minus 2i. Square root of 4 is 2, but the square root of negative 1 is I, so we have to have the plus 2i, plus or minus 2i. And the last step, I'm going to subtract my 1 from both sides, and my final answer is x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2i. If you need to watch this again, or print out this sheet, you really want to have a good, comfortable grasp of completing the square. It's really not a hard concept once you understand that it's almost like a formula. It just takes a little while to get to it. Okay, I think everybody, once you get to this stage where we have to factor or solve for x, I'm not worried about this part of it. I think most of you have a good grasp on that. It's this part right here in the middle where I've got to get the b over 2 squared and then add it to both sides and multiply by the 3 on the outside. That's the tricky part. That's what you have to remember. Watch this. Print it out. If you have questions, I'll bring them with you to class.